today's podcast, the guest is Marc Goldman, who's the Director of Architecture, Engineering and Construction Industry Solutions at Esri. Welcome to the BimTube Podcast. Today we've got Marc Goldman, who's going to talk to me today. So thank you, first of all, Marc. Very pleased to have you with me.
Very glad to be here.
And I know you've probably seen one or two of the other podcasts, so you'll know it's fairly... well, I say loose. You did send through a few ideas of topics that we might talk about. And just to remind the people listening or watching this, the typical audience I have in mind are people that are probably not specialists in information management or geospatial. So although they're things that we do, obviously we'll keep that in mind, that there'll be some people watching that don't even know what interoperability is. That's fine. We can educate them. This is my hope. So anyway, so again, thank you for joining me. And if you could just introduce yourself and your background. So again, I'm very aware that people have very different backgrounds, and people converge. So it'd be really interesting to understand your sort of path about how you started to get to the role
Certainly.
that you have now. So over to you, Marc.
Yeah, no, I'm glad to. Thank you for the invitation to share my perspectives on a topic that I think both of us have some commonalities and certainly strong opinions and expertise on, I hope. So I started out in the AEC industry back a few decades ago now. As I look back, I studied architecture and engineering at Tulane University in New Orleans. Even before going off to college, I was dabbling in some early CAD systems where your computer was the size of your desk and your monitor weighed as much as a car. And the power of the computer was, less than today's watches. But the design side, the engineering side, building and documenting projects really wasn't my passion. The technology was. So even in these early days of CAD, I was applying those tools to my studio classes against the suggestions of my professors. I ended up leaving university, did a couple of projects in commercial and residential and some industrial, some manufacturing projects using CAD, and realized that there was a great opportunity to add to the industry. So I started a consulting business back in the early 90s, focused on various CAD workflows. I joined Autodesk in 94, worked there for about 5 or 6 years until the .com craze got my attention. Joined a startup that was giving Revit a run for its money at the time, and it kind of went by the wayside. Ended up rejoining Autodesk after a period of time. I've worked at Hexagon. I've consulted to Trimble. I've worked with various CAD, now BIM companies over the many years. You mentioned, the term interoperability being something that a lot of folks don't know about, don't understand the term. It's funny, I got involved with some of the very earliest initiatives around interoperability in AEC when I was at Autodesk on the early, what is now the Building Smart International effort on the goals towards interoperability across vendors, common language across our system. So I've been a real strong proponent of interoperability and systems working together, and just kind of a philosophy that we've adopted, I think, most of us today, an expectation of systems just working. So in my years as an end user with fingers on the keyboard, writing code or influencing products as a product manager or promoting products as an evangelist, these days my role at Esri, who is the global leader in GIS, not so often associated with AEC workflows, certainly not as much as it should be and could be. My role is a storyteller. So I meet with a lot of customers, end users from AEC firms, from utilities, from water districts and state and local governments, and serial builders who are building around the globe, and help understand what they're doing to be more productive, to be more effective, to deliver projects on time with CAD, with BIM, and more often now with GIS. And then I'm going out promoting their story. So it's an interesting role of hearing best practices and then trying to translate those into common practice, so that those who may not be familiar with GIS and location data and spatial analysis can come to understand how those can influence the whole plan, design, build, and certainly operate workflows.
Great, thanks, Marc. And I mean, your point there about storytelling and communicating, again, that's literally your day job. But again, that's what I typically find is missing with some people generally. Everyone has a different background. I mean, it's interesting that's your focus. I mean, there's so many angles we could take here, but we don't have long, I'm afraid. But I mean, why don't we just tackle the big one that we mentioned there, interoperability? So again, there'll be some people who think, yeah, I know more than you want to know about it. Other people literally won't know what it means. So maybe just outline what you mean by that, and then some of the big sort of challenges and maybe the big successes as well, because I think things have come forward a long way in the last handful of years.
Yeah, I saw a definition of it recently. I mean, the exact words aren't going to come to mind, I'm sure, but it's essentially systems and people being able to work together around their data without going to exhaustive measures. It's something that I don't know if Apple coined this phrase, used it in their marketing, or just the Apple community kind of rallied around it. That it just works. Systems just work together. Our Apple Watch and our iPad and our MacBook Pro just seem to all work together. There's an element of interoperability between those, even though the platforms are quite different. The operating systems are different. The interactions that you use, when you're interacting with these different platforms is quite different, but everything just seems to work together across those applications. Apple has certainly embraced interoperability without necessarily marketing it. In our industry, I don't think we'll ever get to a point where one software vendor completely dominates, and hopefully we quite honestly don't. Competition is good. The various vendors are going to focus on their strengths, whether that's being a design tool for infrastructure, or a visualization tool for buildings, or a collaboration tool for entire teams of stakeholders to get together around data and make decisions at high levels. The need for information to be exchanged without jumping through exhaustive measures, so that those models can be viewed, the properties can be analyzed, the visuals can be of the proper fidelity. That's what I guess interoperability means at the end of the day. In more peeling back the layers, it means that the various vendors at least agree on standards that the industry players, the end users, the technologists, the owner-operators, as well as the design and engineering firms, have worked together to define those properties, define the geometries that should be exchanged across the platform, so that each company can focus on their strength, but deliver solutions that might be outside of their strengths. And these days, I would say that very much revolves around the efforts by Building Smart and the evolving definition, the growing capabilities of the IFC format and various other initiatives from IFC. There's other organizations that are typically more regional than global, that are working on the exchange of information. One that comes to mind in the US is the Construction Progress Coalition, CPC, who work on things like RFIs and financial information being exchanged, as well as geometries and properties across CAD and BIM systems. So that it's a big term, it's a big word, interoperability. It is something that was not common in conversations in the industry outside of those industry organizations, but it has become something that I think we start, we're reading articles, we're seeing at events and trade shows that might not be focused on interop. That topic is more often than not now discussed. How often does your product X work with product Y? Will they just work together? Can I exchange data? And just to toot our own horn at Esri, we've been a big supporter of IFC for many years. We're staying on the cutting, bleeding edge of that format, being able to bring in data from a wide range of CAD and BIM and various other applications and data sources, but IFC in particular, and allow the AEC industry to use GIS as a tool for analyzing, visualizing, sharing, collaborating, very often around IFC, as well as proprietary formats as well.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Mark. I was very interested when you began your response there. You said technology or data and people, and I think it's the and people bit is, well, let's say things do, information systems do hook up together. It's happening, and you're part of that, a big part of it. Have you got any observation or something to say maybe about a skills gap or a language challenge or communication. Again, just a quick anecdote. There's a project I was working on about a decade ago, and I'd written a standard about data interoperability, CAD to GIS, and I had to use different language, different words, different. So I'd put the word polygon, and a colleague of mine who was more familiar with sort of AutoCAD said, "Oh no, we call that a closed polyline." And we were sort of, but I remember that made me laugh, thinking, but have you got any observations or just something to add about the challenges and how people are overcoming them with the terminology difference and the meaning, the semantic difference?
Yeah, I smile because I remember a project I worked on many years ago when I was at Autodesk as a product manager, and we were developing a bit of functionality. I'm going to digress for a second here. And this functionality allowed the user to access a library of pre-built parts and pieces, a CAD library, essentially, of blocks. And we called it the content browser, which was fine. I mean, it meant a lot to people who where English was their first language. But as we intended to globalize it, it translated into a happy shopper, a content browser. So yeah, there's a lot that you can get caught up around the axle with terminology. Something in specific to our world today that I've seen evolving in that very example that you pointed out about CAD and GIS, that CAD operates with lines, arcs, and circles that are based on a projection where your coordinate system is typically 0, 0, 0 as your lower left-hand corner. Maybe it's the fire hydrant that's nearby, and you base everything off of that. And even if your projects are spanning across an entire countryside, the use of real-world coordinate systems is an afterthought, let's say, or is not a strong consideration because you're breaking your project up into drawings that are being, boiled down to a user coordinate system. Whereas GIS is based on the real world, and it's based on a real world view that might be at a high level, like a satellite image, where your level of accuracy is tens of centimeters, perhaps. It might be that you're doing your infrastructure work and drone imagery or fixed wing flights are all you need as your basis of design. In those cases, millimeter accuracy is the best you're ever going to get. You're really only going to get that when you get down to terrestrial scanning, quite frankly. So, one of the things that is not necessarily a language differentiation, but a challenge of coming from different perspectives is expectations around GIS with satellite imagery is going to be as accurate as as I'm used to in my CAD system, where I could go to fractions and fractions of inches or millimeters. But GIS doesn't do that at that highest level. You can get that, and we certainly have projects where the IFC or the Revit models or MicroStation files are being brought into GIS, and the accuracy is as great as the authoring CAD system or BIM system that built that content. But it's not necessarily an issue of terminology in that case. It's just this expectation that you would be able to use a satellite image and you would get the accuracy that you're used to in your CAD system. Instead, I think that expectations just need to be set that if you want that level of accuracy, then you should be using terrestrial ground-based scanners. And then you bring that information into your GIS environment, and then you get that millimeter or even sub-millimeter accuracy. So that's one kind of breakdown that I've seen in people who are used to one system being requested to or having their eyes open to another system, GIS in this case, and just need to align their expectations that if they want that great accuracy that CAD and BIM have brought them, then they should not be relying on satellite imagery coming from 100 miles above the Earth's surface. Instead, they should be walking through the job site with a SLAM scanner or setting up tripods and generating reality capture information that they then can compare their BIM to, and the level of accuracy is what they would need. That's one example that just comes to mind.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good example when you talk about expectation, because that expectation is set from experience typically, isn't it? So if you're from a AEC background, so you've seen it all, I think that I completely agree with you. There is a challenge, particularly you mentioned remote sensing. I mean, that's rightly or wrongly, that can still seem as another thing to people, can't it? If GIS is reasonably definable and CAD is reasonably definable, remote sensing is covers all of it. So that's a really good example. Maybe just moving on to what's being done about it and how there are steps forward, obviously from your personal perspective, but obviously from Esri as well. The emergence of GIS and AEC workflows, so sort of more of the if you like, the things that are being developed now or emergent examples. Have you got any examples to share of current best practice? Yeah,
numerous. Yeah, it's been I've been at Esri for a little more than 3 years, and when I started, we were organizing our thoughts around plan, design, build, operate, and finding examples within each of those. We've pivoted a little bit to focus our strategy around the way people more self-identify. If you are working as an environmental manager, if you're working as an architect on urban planning, or an engineer developing the plans and the execution to construct a bridge, we've organized ourselves around those segments of the industry. And within each one, the examples that I keep coming across are really phenomenal, where interoperability is key and multiple data layers coming together to solve really great problems. The ones that, just to pick up on what we were talking about of interoperability and CAD and BIM and GIS coming together, probably mostly fall into design and engineering and construction workflows these days. And I'll get to maybe both of those. On the design and engineering side, it used to be the case where, like you were saying, bringing together this data not only had different terms, but like I mentioned, different tolerances, different expectations of users caused a lot of disconnects. Bringing your CAD into GIS, trying to use a map as an underlay into a project that was based in a CAD or a BIM project was exhaustive work. There was translations, there was rubber banding, there was stretching, there was coordinate system transformations. It was hard work. You had to be a math expert just to move beyond into the first stages of putting a line on screen. And those barriers have, for the most part, been completely removed. The interoperability, the data exchanges in particular between Autodesk solutions and Esri solutions is really phenomenal. I mean, I personally was involved in a project a couple of decades ago where we were trying to visualize specific floor plans in the context of dilapidated properties in New Orleans. I went to school in New Orleans, and I moved into a project straight out of school. And it was weeks and weeks, literally, of just trying to bring data together. These days, the examples that we've promoted in webinars, the customer examples I've seen of bringing this data together, where we directly are bringing in DWG files, where we are bringing in directly Revit files, IFC files into that GIS environment with full fidelity, all the properties you would want, dashboards being created that allow you to tap into those properties of the BIM information, or to tap into the repositories where your BIM data lives in a GIS view, is literally minutes. Like we can go to a trade show floor and someone can ask us, how do BIM and GIS work together? And we'll start with a blank screen and bring in the BIM data into a GIS map and create a dashboard in front of the user's eyes, literally in minutes. So that's fun to be able to show off. And those are very often in, like the design and engineering workflows. Around construction, we're doing the same. We're bringing together the CAD and the BIM and GIS. But what we're finding in construction is the need for reality capture and field data work, which is often done in, at best, PDFs, where you might fill in some fields and that PDF just becomes a dumb form in many workflows. We're finding that some of the tools that we have for field data collection that maybe historically were used for environmental management or used for workflows where people just needed to collect survey information, those same tools applied to construction allow RFIs and field validation and quality workflows to have a location element to them. So you're able to not just collect conditions of a project and report that data up to management. You're able to visualize that on a map and see where, through heat maps and spatial analysis, where your issues keep occurring. And not only do you get ahead of those issues, you're more productive in sending people out to address them and fix them, because through a map, you can understand that it makes the most sense to send your worker to point A and then point B and then point C before, you send 3 teams all over the place and you've lost productivity. So that combination of location information applied to construction is one that I didn't expect when I joined Esri. I did not expect so much value from location data to be applied to the real built processes. But we've got a bunch of construction companies. One of my favorite set of stories come from Skanska, UK, doing work in HS2, doing work across the entire UK, and having GIS be the collaboration tool, the interoperability hub of data coming from MicroStation, coming from AutoCAD, coming from Revit, coming from field data, and then these dashboards being used so that the entire team can be kept in the know. So it's been fun for me.
Great. And just, I will put a link, anything you refer, obviously I'll put a link in the bottom. So I do know fairly well George Flores and Anita Soni, who
yes,
I'll give them a shout out. So obviously you won't know, but I am well acquainted with them. And so that's great. And I will refer to the projects that you're talking about. It's interesting because it obviously with AEC is by definition your architecture, engineering, construction, for maybe one or two people that don't know what that is, unbelievably. I have a confession, because my background is more in the asset, originally in the asset management, and I mean the whole life asset management, but obviously the implication is things like maintenance as well. In the example you're giving there, you then did talk about efficiency and operation or maintenance. And it's interesting. I don't know if you've got any comments, because you are literally looking at the whole life in the example.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll often have to, and I'll say AECOO, and then people go, what do you mean by that? And then we have to explain. AEC doesn't quite sit so well in the UK. It's not instinctive what it means necessarily to people, so we have to explain it. But do you see still, maybe not in your profession because you're doing it, but with others, a disconnect between CapEx, so the capital delivery of projects, to the construction side, and the operational side? I mean, for you, obviously, no, because in one breath you're saying the whole life. But do you still see that divide between people who operate and maintain and people who build things?
I think there's been a real shift these last couple of years, and I think COVID had something to do with it. I think there was a rising tide of the expectation for technology to solve problems amongst the owner community, and whether that is the water district, the state and local governments, the federal governments, who are typically the largest owners of properties of any country, an expectation that their decades-long investment in CAD data, in BIM, it's called BIM models, in digital views of their assets, that putting them to use has finally been monetized. That for years, the idea of delivering a project and getting CAD files, or delivering a project and getting a Revit or an IFC or a DGN model to go with it, has been in contracts, but putting that information to use has not necessarily been a priority. And I think that as we found ourselves stuck at our homes or limited to the number of people who could show up at a job site, the expectation that the data we had and the data that we were continuing to require needed to be put to more use. So while we found ourselves in this situation that was beyond our control, we also were in the midst of a generational shift where the asset operators, the teams that are maintaining our facilities and infrastructure, often led by someone who might have retired a few years ago or is very close to retirement and is being replaced by a digital native, someone who grew up with something digital in their hand. There's an expectation that they'll be able to use those same tools that they use to book a reservation, that they'll have that same tool that allows them to tap into the performance data of their pumps and the machinery, or run a quick report while they're not in the office of the depreciation of their assets they've invested in for so many years. So there's been a rising tide I've seen, and then I think COVID was a catalyst of putting that into action. So although there has been a disconnect in that the owners have recognized technology was valuable and an expectation that they would require their architects, engineers, contractors to deliver something digitally, the last couple of years I've seen owners demand not just that digital delivery, but I'll throw out a little bit of buzzword bingo, a digital twin, and that representation of their asset has value, that there's a connection between the historical performance data that they have in perhaps their Maximo system and the BIM and CAD data that they use to understand where things are, gets connected to remote sensors so they know how systems are behaving in real time. And that is becoming pretty mainstream. The growth of digital twins across the globe from owners as part of the deliverable not only helps those owners be more efficient, more operationally effective, but it also allows those firms who are delivering a project today to be connected to that owner for the long term. So I think we're going to look back and say that 2022, 2023, there's a number of technology shifts that occurred and technology adoptions that took place. And I think digital twin will come into its own as one of those things we look back on and say that those were the years that we changed from just building things physically and getting digital deliverables, but that we used those artifacts to be more effective.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And you mentioned digital twin, so that was on one of my check boxes to mention. So you beat me to it. So we don't have to go there. And but yeah, it does all come down to that feedback loop, doesn't it? For the benefit of people listening or watching, what's the difference? I mean, we don't want to define digital twin necessarily here, but for me, it's that feedback loop. Most people won't know a lot of my career has been in GIS, and it used to be a one-way flow, or it shouldn't have been. It'd have to go back, beg, stealing, and borrowing, saying, "Please, can we have a new survey?" And I think that feedback loop is the critical difference. And you also mentioned Maximo, again, for the benefit of people that don't know, that's a enterprise asset management tool.
Mm-hmm.
Others are available, Ellipse, for example. But I mean, that's really interesting, because that's how I got into this, actually, at the London Underground. We had Maximo, this is like 15 years ago, and I was the GIS manager, and we linked them, but it wasn't easy, and it took a lot of time. And I think that's a huge shift, isn't it, to say, now that, like you were just saying, now there's an expectation of these things being hooked up, and there's an expectation of information flow between them, and that sets the bar somewhere different, doesn't it? I mean, it's yeah.
I think that what allows us to talk about digital twins versus just CAD and BIM is sensors, IoT devices, remote data collection happening without sending people out to that machine to look at a gauge to know whether it's performing correctly, and then look up a warranty manual in a binder somewhere to understand whether or not that performance is within the highs and lows, and then look into another system to understand when it was last maintained and when you should replace the filters or the entire piece of equipment. That's still standard practice, that method that I just described there, but the lack of efficiency is enormous. And if you could instead instrument your equipment with sensors and have those sensors automatically show up in a dashboard performance, and through that performance send a notification to a work order system that a particular person should go out and replace something a week or two from now, and just be most effective in the way you utilize your scarce resources, who wouldn't want to do that? And a number of things have come to allow us to do that. The growth of the internet being more than just a place we go to play, but a complete infrastructure that we use to run our business. The emergence of standards within sensors of collecting data and being able to be read by enterprise systems, whether it's a GIS platform or SAP or Maximo, like we talked about, various platforms adopting these standard ways of viewing information, and then certainly the fact that we now hold in our hands, whether it's a tablet or a phone or, for that matter, a watch, that connects all of that data to our person. I think this was science fiction, Star Trek and Star Wars kind of things just a few years ago, but they've come together, and it's the number of projects, like I said, that I see on a regular basis from AEC firms who are working on behalf of an owner. They're not doing these projects. They're not implementing technology necessarily just for their own sake. They're doing it to win jobs. They're doing it because funding that comes often from the government through the public and private sector into the hands of the AEC firms more often now is actually requiring technology and requiring these workflows to be supported automatically, as opposed to, like we talked about earlier, just the delivery of a CAD file.
Yeah, and it's really good that you mentioned that the client, or however it's defined, the employer, the client, is asking for it, and that all requires the client being educated. I mean, a lot of my day job is working with ultimate end clients, whether it's government or otherwise, because I think that that can be difficult, can't it? If you don't know what you don't know, right? We're talking about interoperability. You know, I mean, as an end client, as a non-technical specialist, it can be difficult. I mean, I don't know if you've got any observations, or how do we educate the end client, and I mean non-technical, sort of senior management people.
You know, I think that there's certainly work on all of our parts to do that, and you know, I do that at a private company called Esri through webinars and articles and all of that. But that's kind of the tail wagging the dog. It's got to happen before that, and it's been refreshing to see, at least in the U.S., I can specifically point to examples where the funding that the government is pushing through, that in some ways has been architected and orchestrated to keep us from slipping into recession, was in some ways in response to the economic downturn that COVID created. But the IIJA, the multi-trillion-dollar investments that the government is funding for infrastructure improvements, in addition to the funding to actually send people out and use physical materials to build new bridges and roads, in those same laws now are requirements for technology adoption. So from the top down, from the very, you follow the money, luckily, I'd say, there is recognition from our administration and certainly around the globe that technology is not just a differentiator for businesses, but it is a tool to allow the government, to allow the private sector to operate facilities better, for bridges to last longer, for buildings to stay up and be functional for longer periods of time. So there is an element of lobbying and hard work that is way above or outside of my pay grade that has to happen, because if there is not a monetary incentive to adopt technologies, it's not going to happen. People are not going to adopt technology just for the sake of tech. There has to be some benefit. There certainly are plenty of examples where technology does provide more productivity, reduces errors. But I'd say at the end of the day, if our governments are not, who are funding a large percentage of work, if they are not incenting the private sector to use tech in the build out of infrastructure, then it's at least a hurdle. It's not necessarily a requirement, but it's just one more barrier to adoption. And it's been refreshing to see. I've got people within Esri that I work with who have combed through these 1,000-page bills and have highlighted the examples where, in all, to boil it down, digital twin is a requirement for delivery of projects. I personally just found out that I'll be sitting as a vice chair of the digital twin committee within the U.S.'s National Institute of Building Standards, which is the organization responsible for developing the kind of BIM standards that the UK did almost a decade ago. So the U.S. has certainly got on board. The UK was perhaps the tip of the spear in many cases. A lot of us, around the globe point to the UK and thank you for the work that you guys have done in, requiring digitization in the process of infrastructure build out. So that's just, one take on it.
Yeah, that take on it, as far as it being like a pull rather than a push, in this case, we're talking obviously about governments, whether it's federal or obviously in the UK, the central government. Again, it's the same kind of mandate. I mean, but then it's sort of a multi-pronged attack, isn't it? In the sense of then we need to incentivize people, and I think the fact that we're talking now, things are going in the right direction. I think so I completely 100% agree with everything you've said. I mean, it's amazing that we can talk about these things, and the people that hopefully watch or listen to this also don't need to be specialists. I know I mentioned that several times, but what I'm getting at, I think there's a genuine breakthrough, whether everything's coming together, whether it's language, whether it's the requirement, the mandate, as you were just saying, there's a need to do these things. So it's not a nice
and there's
to
a
have.
capability, the ability to do this. I recall a presentation when I worked at Autodesk back in the 90s where the CEO at the time, Carol Bartz, put up a presentation of things just working together beautifully. And it was science fiction. It was this magical environment where things are going to work together, and these workflows that we've talked about being real today were absolutely dreamland a decade ago. We wanted to do it. There was perhaps even mandates to do it, but the technology was not there. We were working on disconnected PCs without the computing power to visualize. There was not an element of sensors being a standard way of practice, whether it's sensors within concrete letting us know when the concrete is cured, or sensors on machinery letting us know its performance, or actuators on windows and vents opening as we need them to. That was just not a capability that existed. So yeah, I'd say that we're at this perfect storm, if you will, of the need to make it happen, the recognition that, climate change and sustainability and ESG goals that many of us are adopting as a standard practice must be adhered to, or at least recognized. The generational shift, like I mentioned, that there's fewer and fewer people who would say, but that's the way we've always done it, because those who are now growing up and getting into the workforce in management are expecting things to work better than they have in the past. And then certainly the various technologies that we've talked about is that capability. So yeah, it couldn't have happened if we still were working in disconnected technical environments without practically unlimited computing and AI and ML and all that comes with that. Visualization capabilities on our desktop that bring the real world and simulated worlds together in ways that allow anyone to understand the environment. You don't need to be an architect or an engineer with a license and letters behind your name to understand the built environment anymore. The visualization capabilities have come so far. So yeah, it is a good time to be in this industry of working on the technologies related to the built and natural world.
Absolutely, I completely agree. I remember early in my career things were not connected. I remember physically driving. I used to work for the Central UK Government in cartography and then GIS. Physically driving hundreds of miles. Maybe it doesn't sound a lot if you're from the US, but anyway, it's a long way here. Just to physically update things with CDs because we couldn't pass the data over, which now seems absolutely crazy. But this. And I was managing a GIS team, but I still had to physically. I mean, it's interesting because the shift changes now. Certainly, earlier in my career, it used to be getting the data, cleansing data, acquiring data, and now it's moving towards what do we do with all the workflow. Yeah. Have you got anything to say? We may have. I know we've touched on workflow. I mean, that's been a persistent thing, but if we take it up a level, sort of business process, one observation I have is we can describe workflow because it is tangible. We can, at a technical level, it's not, it's difficult, but it's not infinitely complex. If you go up a level to sort of a more abstract process, the challenge can be, I don't know if you've got anything to say about this, about maybe you've run workshops and maybe with clients who are not technical. It can be challenging to then think of a new process. How do we? So we're talking digital transformation here, and then that's a conversation around process optimization. Have you got anything to say, or any challenges, or how do we help people improve their business?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, change management is definitely in the conversation with our customers they see the light, they see examples that we present to them. And there certainly is, but we don't do it that way, and we just can't change as quickly as you're proposing, Mark. So at Esri, we actually have a team who focus on change management for our clients and provide, some free and some paid consultation when the customer understands they just need to change, but don't necessarily have the tools in-house. And it's very rarely that they just need to adopt technology, that they just need to upgrade their servers, they just need to go from an enterprise system to a cloud-based system. That's rarely the problem. Typically it is an element of personalities and skill gaps, and just processes that are almost cultural within an organization that need to be affected. So we don't fool ourselves to think that it's just a matter of buy 3 more licenses and upgrade your hardware and you're going to be as effective as you were yesterday and everyone's going to be happy. We clearly recognize that people are often the big cost in getting to that point of digital transformation. And by that term, I don't just mean going from paper to PDF, but truly changing work processes so that information is exchanged, data is exchanged, not just files being exchanged.
Yeah, and maybe it's not a big bang, as maybe it's iterative, or I mean, it
Yeah,
depends on the
yeah.
company, doesn't it? But again, I know I'm just putting it out there for people listening or watching, that it can take time, can't it? I mean,
you can't necessarily just drop your methods and approach to running your business because a new software allows you to do things digitally. You work with external parties, you have timelines and milestones that you need to continue to meet, and bringing in new tech can often cause churn and issues and slow things down. So yeah, technology is not necessarily the panacea to solving all the problems a business is encountering as the world is changing around them. It is a lot of change management of the humans who need to continue doing their work, and then they need to slipstream often these technologies in, and we take a crawl, walk, run approach with our customers. Very rarely are we coming in and saying, okay, wipe everything out. Here's a new way. You no longer are going to be using yellow pads and PDFs. It's completely going to be replaced with survey 1, 2, 3 forms that are going to feed into a stack of web scenes, and everyone's going to be using their browser to do all the work that they used to do on paper. It's okay. Let's find something that is, find some low-hanging fruit that has fewer implications, that can be a small win, that can convince from the people in the bottom up to the top that that technology can solve these same problems they've been doing through analog processes. And iteratively, like you said, you'll get to the point where you're not slowed down. You truly are running faster than you've ever been able to run, with more quality and all the other benefits we talked about.
Yeah, and I think that's it, isn't it? To have that agile approach, and it's not necessarily instinctive for everybody. Again, it's just an observation for people watching or listening.
Yeah, we all want to change. No, let's see. We all want change, but we all don't want to change. We want things to be better, but we don't necessarily want to change our approach because comfort zones and all of that. That's the real soft issues of people.
And it is challenging. I think that's the other thing. I mean, I expect the challenge. Most of my day job is the change management side of it now, and it's an expectation. If it was easy, we'd all do it. If it was easy, and also people, depending who you are in an organization, it's not necessarily somebody's day job to change things. I think that's the other. You know what I mean? I think that's it. People are there to get on with their job, and it's not necessarily to rock the boat and look. Some people it will be their job, but it's not. Most people, it's not their job to look at efficient ways of re-engineering business process. That's quite a niche. Anyway, I mean, I could talk about that at length, but it's about you. Just because we don't have too long left, and I think we've touched on so many brilliant things that I could drill down on, but there was just something to ask you. One of the, again, my career being in GIS, I think in the last, I don't know, decade or even 5 years, I've seen massive steps forward in the dashboard type presentation, like significant, because people often say, well, what is GIS like now? And I say, well, I can't really describe the difference because of the dashboard, the web. Where am I going with this? I think where I'm going with it is I see that as a huge way to rationalize and visualize and simplify. If we get everything we wish for, this data interoperability and the rest of it, there'll be so much data. And I think that's where dashboards and keeping things simple. Have you got anything to an example of maybe dashboards and simplification of visualization is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, one of the most brilliant things that I've seen Esri come up with in the last couple of years is through collaboration with Autodesk. So before 5 years ago, Autodesk and Esri were staunch competitors. Autodesk had a various set of mapping solutions. They still have AutoCAD Map that is used for a number of workflows. But there were tools that were GIS at Autodesk, and Esri's capabilities around CAD and BIM were quite weak. We were two different companies, but competing often for customers who were trying to do some of the same things in both of our products. 5 years ago, put the guard down, Jack Dangerman, the CEO of Autodesk, and Andrew Anagnost got up at Autodesk University. I think Andrew was quite new in that role. Surprised everyone that they were on the same stage together and announced a partnership. The initial deliverables from that were plugins, let's call them, that Autodesk built at within Civil 3D, within BIM 360, within InfraWorks, as well as collaboration with Esri, so that we would be able to read those native formats that I mentioned earlier directly. So we had this one-way exchange going both ways between the different platforms. You could bring GIS into your authoring tools, you could bring the BIM and CAD data into your GIS tools, and a lot of workflows were improved. Back about 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, the work started, and a year and a half ago, we released a product called ArcGIS GeoBIM, where the maps that you've created that have BIM and CAD data within them get visualized in your browser. You click on a BIM object, and on the right side opens up the Forge viewer, which I guess is no longer called the Forge viewer, with data that is coming from BIM 360 or Autodesk Construction Cloud. And then on the left side, the right side, on the bottom, you might then have various UI controls that are showing you in real time sensor data, or that are performing spatial analysis or data analysis against the properties of that BIM data. So you've got this dashboard view that is a 3D map that connects to the deepest, properties and elements of your BIM data that's housed in your BIM repository, and then dashboard controls wrapped around it, telling you how your project is performing, how your team is working. And then to add on to that, we've also integrated with Oracle P6, so that your BIM objects and your GIS features have a location element to them, so that you're able to schedule and see schedule status in a single UI. So it's in some ways, it's kind of a holy grail that I've been pursuing for a long time. Web-based 3D, 4D, 5D information without worrying about where's the Revit file and where's the CAD data and where's my P6 schedule, but everything connected, kind of as we started talking about earlier, as being the nirvana, and being able to be understood by someone who doesn't have a copy of Revit or a copy of P6, but instead they're just going to their browser. They've been granted permissions to this dashboard, and they're able to interact with data that historically have been pretty locked down.
Yeah,
that's we're seeing numerous projects across the globe using this tool, ArcGIS GeoBIM.
Thank you, Mark. Sorry to cut you off there. I think that's a great example because it natively connects together, and I think the challenges that would have been, I don't know, maybe multi-million project. Who knows? Yeah. I've worked on lots of systems integration projects in my time, and they're not cheap. Let's put it that way. So, yeah. I mean that hurdle, that bar of integration is taken away. And you mentioned Primavera P6 there as well. Mm-hmm. I think a project. I always think of master data management. Again, there'll be people watching this that aren't necessarily data professionals, but single source of truth, a lot of people call it, but conceptually in IT or information management, master data, where should you master data or information? Probably where it's best to master it. Yes. And not have copy. And again, people always say, oh, should we copy? I don't know. You gave the example of project planning, Primavera. I think I'll always say the best place to have planning information is probably in the planning tool. And I think that makes sense, right?
I take some argument against the term a common data environment, because what comes to mind for me is a single silo, let's say, where everything has been mashed together, but instead it's a connected data environment, and you keep the data where it is best suited, where it is most native, and you make sure that you can connect to those various sources in an environment that those who might not have had a connection to it in the past but needed it can access it. You made a comment, what is GIS today? I think in the past it was 2D maps. It was various layers brought together in 2D and then generated in a static file for multiple purposes. GIS I've seen evolve, or I've come to understand, is much more than that. And it is a collaboration tool. It is certainly spatial analysis and connecting graph databases to various types of vector and raster information. But very often GIS is used as a tool for collaborating. Lots of engineering under the hood, but bringing people together to access data they wouldn't have had access to otherwise wouldn't have been able to work with outside of spreadsheets or CAD systems or scheduling tools in a silo. It's great to see GIS as this collaboration environment as much as an engineering or an analysis tool.
Yeah, and I think that accessibility, or people can understand what they see, that it's a way in as well, can't it? A portal or whatever. So again, I'll link to some examples down. Our time is nearly up, Mark. I mean, I could talk all day about these things because it's absolutely fascinating how things have come together. I started in GIS, and that's part of but then I sort of fell into now what's called BIM, or the international standards. So absolutely fascinating how these things have come together. I guess people can look back and say, well, it's inevitable things would have converged, and I would say correct, but maybe not as quick as they are. I mean, you mentioned about the strategic collaboration between Autodesk and Esri. I think, yeah, things are happening really fast, aren't they? It can be hard for people to keep up with some of the developments, I think.
Yeah, one thing I quote my friend Ian Howell, who has been at the front of the effort at Building Smart and the whole IFC initiative, that he said for 20 years, felt like a number of us were pushing this rock uphill. And most recently, it feels like there's a bunch of people at the top of the hill helping to pull that rock up. So yeah, maybe it was inevitable. Maybe enough people could have gotten behind these efforts and made things happen. But there's been a number of changes in the industry, in our mindset, demographics, whatever it might be, that enough people are behind the effort and more people now are in front of it, that the inevitability has come around sooner than maybe some of us would have projected.
So I like your analogy. I would, if I dare take your analogy, because it's your analogy, I would say that even on your metaphorical rock, I'd say it's running downhill now. What would you say? I mean, do you think? I mean, I don't think we're pulling it uphill anymore. I think it's going. It's off.
It could be. I was involved in the very earliest days of that specific initiative, and certainly others, and the critical mass and the interest, the open source community around IFC and AEC interoperability, that we could talk about for an hour or more. Yeah, there's definitely momentum in this industry that wasn't there for many years.
Yes, I will, Mark. I've had my time with you, but just very, very briefly, I know you've mentioned a few references, but just for people particularly people that are new to this kind of sector, just sort of rapid fire, if you can, what website should they look at and just search for? Just a handful. I know there's
I'll give you a couple.
Yeah.
Esri.com, ESRI.com/AEC. That's kind of our front door to the AEC industry at Esri. If you want to reach out to me or any of my team members, best would probably be aecinfo@esri.com. That'll drop into a few people's inboxes. LinkedIn is always a place to go to find me. I always keep my activities posted there. You'll see us at most of the big AEC industry events in the US, in the UK, in Ireland, globally. We try to be wherever the conversation is these days. So I look forward to meeting you at one of those in person, Stephen, and any and many of your audience as well.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much, Mark. Thank you for your time. I, like you, no doubt, I could talk all day about these things, but I've had my time with you, so who knows, we'll do it again, I hope, one day. But thank you so much for your time and your insight. So thank you, Mark.
My pleasure talking with someone like yourself.
Great. Thanks, Mark.
Take care, Stephen.